Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a place that promises healing, but delivers something closer to a medieval lottery where the odds are never in your favor. Welcome to the medieval hospital, where miracles are advertised, hygiene is a rumor, and the cure is almost certainly worse than the disease. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy drifting off to deeply unsettling, surprisingly factual history. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim those lights and settle into your blankets. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to be sick in the Middle Ages? Was it all kindly monks with herbal remedies and gentle prayers? Or more like drafty halls, mysterious potions, and treatments that would make modern medicine weep into its stethoscope? How did medieval patients survive a place with more superstition than science, more faith than facts, and medical techniques that make your worst nightmare look like a spa day? What did the doctors actually know? What were the nurses really doing? And why did everyone seem to believe that bleeding out half your blood supply was somehow a good idea? Let's find out. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1348, somewhere in the heart of medieval England. You're feverish, confused, and there's a pain in your side that feels like someone's been using your ribs as target practice. The good news is that there's a hospital nearby. The bad news is that it's a medieval hospital, and the only thing more dangerous than your illness is about to be your treatment. You stumble through a stone archway, greeted by the smell of incense barely masking something far worse underneath, and the distant sound of prayers that might be for healing or might be for the souls of those who didn't make it through the night. Welcome to your new home for the foreseeable future. Don't mind the moaning, that's just the atmosphere. Let's set the scene properly. If you're picturing a medieval hospital as anything remotely like a modern medical facility, I'm going to need you to adjust those expectations dramatically. Think less sterile white corridors and sophisticated equipment, and more converted monastery with delusions of grandeur. The medieval hospital is part poorhouse, part prayer hall, part hospice, and part desperate last resort for people who've run out of other options. The word hospital itself comes from the Latin hospice, meaning guest or stranger, and that tells you everything you need to know about the original purpose. These weren't places primarily designed for medical treatment. They were places of hospitality for pilgrims, travelers, the poor, the elderly, and yes, occasionally the sick. The idea that a hospital should actually cure people was almost secondary to its function as a charitable institution where the religious could practice good works and hopefully secure their place in heaven. Most medieval hospitals were founded and run by religious orders. Monks, nuns, and various brotherhoods dedicated themselves to caring for the unfortunate, which sounds lovely until you realize that their medical training consisted primarily of prayer, faith, and whatever folk remedies had been passed down through generations of well-meaning amateurs. The chief physician was usually God, with the human staff serving as his somewhat unreliable assistants. The physical structure of a typical hospital would have been modest at best. Stone walls that sweated with damp, narrow windows that let in more cold than light, and floors that had seen better centuries. The beds, if you could call them that, were wooden frames with straw mattresses shared between multiple patients. Privacy was a concept that belonged to the nobility, not the sick and dying. You'd be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with fellow sufferers, sharing their germs, their lice, and their nightly chorus of groans and prayers. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Despite all this, medieval hospitals were genuinely revolutionary for their time. Before their establishment, if you got sick and you weren't wealthy enough to afford a personal physician, you simply died at home, in the street, or wherever your illness happened to find you. The hospital, for all its limitations, represented an organized attempt to provide care for those who had nowhere else to turn. It was charity with a capital C, faith made manifest in stone and straw. The largest hospitals could accommodate hundreds of patients. Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century and still standing today, was one of the most famous. It sprawled along the banks of the Seine, a massive complex where the sick lay in rows, tended by Augustinian sisters who had dedicated their lives to this grim but sacred work. In England, St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, founded in 1123, became a beacon for the desperate, though what they found there was often as likely to kill them as cure them. The hospital chapel was always the heart of the institution, literally and spiritually. The beds would often be arranged so that patients could see the altar, because if physical healing wasn't possible, at least spiritual preparation for the next world was always available. Masses were said multiple times daily, the Latin chants rising and falling like a tide of hope and resignation mixed together. If you managed to secure a bed in one of these institutions, you'd quickly learn that the schedule was set by religious observance rather than medical necessity. Dawn brought prayers. Meals, such as they were, came at appointed hours regardless of whether you could actually eat. Treatments happened when the attending brother or sister had finished their devotions and found time between feeding the other patients and preparing the dead for burial. Speaking of meals, let's talk about the hospital diet. Medieval medical theory held that food was medicine, which sounds enlightened until you realize they had some very specific and often baffling ideas about which foods helped which conditions. If you had a fever, you might be given cooling foods like lettuce and cucumbers. If you were considered too cold in your humors, you'd get warming foods like pepper and ginger. The actual nutritional needs of sick people were not well understood, and many patients probably suffered from malnutrition on top of whatever brought them to the hospital in the first place. The staff, for all their dedication, were rarely what we'd call medically trained. The nursing care was provided by religious brothers and sisters whose qualifications were faith, obedience, and a strong stomach. They learned on the job, picking up techniques from their predecessors and whatever scraps of medical knowledge filtered down from the rare educated physician who might occasionally visit. Most of what they knew about treating illness came from ancient texts that had been copied and recopied over centuries, each transcription introducing new errors and misunderstandings. But don't dismiss them entirely. These caregivers showed up every day. They cleaned wounds they didn't understand, fed patients they couldn't cure, and sat with the dying when there was nothing left but to pray. In an age when most people faced illness alone, surrounded only by family members who were equally helpless, the hospital offered something precious even when it couldn't offer a cure. It offered presence, someone to hold your hand, someone to witness your suffering, someone to say the final prayers over your body when you were gone. And so, as you lie in your narrow bed, watching the candlelight flicker on the stone walls and listening to the brother in the next ward ring his bell for prayers, you begin to understand what you've gotten yourself into. This is not a place of medicine as you might know it. This is a place of faith, of charity, of hope in the face of almost certain doom. The cure might kill you, but at least you won't die alone. Welcome to medieval healthcare. May God have mercy on your soul, because the doctors almost certainly won't. Let's talk about the person theoretically responsible for your recovery. The medieval physician is a creature of contradictions, wrapped in expensive robes and armed with theories so confident and so wrong that they would be almost admirable if they weren't so deadly. He's read the ancient texts, he's studied the stars, he's examined more urine than any person should have to in a lifetime, and he's about to make some decisions about your health that you really, really wish he wouldn't. First, understand that medieval physicians were rare and expensive. If you're in a hospital, you probably won't see one often, if at all. The hospitals that did employ physicians kept them for consultations rather than daily care. The actual hands-on work was done by the religious brothers and sisters, with the physician swooping in occasionally to offer his learned opinion, collect his fee, and sweep back out before anyone could blame him for the results. The physician's education was impressive by medieval standards, which means it was thoroughly grounded in ideas that were ancient, elaborate, and almost entirely wrong. He would have studied at a university, one of the great centers of learning like Bologna, Paris, or Oxford, where he would have spent years reading the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and later Arabic scholars like Avicenna, who had preserved and expanded on classical medical knowledge. The foundation of all medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors. This idea, inherited from ancient Greece, held that the human body contained four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on keeping these humors in proper balance. Illness occurred when they fell out of alignment. Too much blood made you sanguine, flushed, and prone to fevers. Too much phlegm made you sluggish and cold. Too much yellow bile made you irritable and hot-tempered.
Too much black bile made you melancholy and prone to depression. Your physician would diagnose your condition by examining the evidence, and by evidence I mean he would stare at your urine for an uncomfortable length of time. Uroscopy, the art of reading urine, was the cornerstone of medieval diagnosis. The color, clarity, consistency, and even smell of your urine were believed to reveal the inner workings of your body. Physicians carried special flasks designed for this purpose, holding them up to the light and consulting elaborate charts that matched different urinary characteristics to different conditions. Beyond urine, your doctor might examine your pulse, though not in the way a modern physician would. The medieval pulse examination was a complex art involving multiple points on the wrist and elaborate theories about what different rhythms and strengths might indicate. He might also examine your stools, if you were lucky enough to produce any, your tongue, your eyes, and the general color and condition of your skin.
Then came the astrology. Medieval physicians were serious about the influence of the stars and planets on human health. The position of celestial bodies was believed to affect different parts of the body and different types of treatment. A careful physician would consult astrological charts before recommending any significant intervention. The wrong alignment of Mars or Saturn could make bloodletting dangerous. The moon's phase might determine when surgery should or shouldn't be performed. You might be perfectly ready for treatment, but if Jupiter was in the wrong house, you'd just have to wait. Once the physician had gathered his evidence, consulted his charts, and perhaps consulted with colleagues if any were available, he would pronounce his diagnosis. This diagnosis would be expressed in terms of humoral imbalance. You weren't simply sick with a fever. You were suffering from an excess of blood that had heated your system and thrown your natural equilibrium into chaos. You didn't just have a stomach ache. You had a surfeit of yellow bile that was corrupting your digestion. The treatment, logically, was to restore balance. And here's where things got really interesting, by which I mean terrifying. If you had too much of a humor, the obvious solution was to remove it. And the most common humor to have in excess, at least according to medieval physicians, was blood. Welcome to bloodletting, the cornerstone of medieval medical treatment, and quite possibly the single most harmful medical practice in history. We'll get to the gory details shortly, but for now, understand that your physician, with all his learning and all his confidence, was about to recommend a treatment that would weaken you significantly in the hopes of restoring a balance that didn't actually exist. The physician might also prescribe medicines, elaborate concoctions of herbs, minerals, and sometimes animal products mixed according to ancient recipes. These might be administered as drinks, as poultices, as enemas, or as suppositories. Some of these remedies contained genuinely useful ingredients. Willow bark, for example, contained compounds related to aspirin and might actually help with pain and fever. Many others were useless at best and toxic at worst. What the physician almost certainly wouldn't do was examine you thoroughly in a physical sense. Medieval medical training was largely theoretical rather than practical. Dissection of human bodies was rare and often forbidden. The physician's knowledge of anatomy came from ancient texts that were themselves often wrong, and his reluctance to get his hands dirty meant that the practical work of medicine fell to others: surgeons, barbers, and the nursing staff who actually touched patients on a daily basis. This social hierarchy meant that the people who knew the most about disease, in practical terms, the nurses and caregivers who saw patients every day, were also the ones with the least formal training and the least authority to make decisions. The physician who visited occasionally and based his recommendations on ancient Greek theories about bodily fluids was considered the expert. The sister who had spent 20 years cleaning wounds and recognizing the signs of different illnesses was considered a servant. If you were wealthy enough to afford a personal physician, you might receive more attention and more elaborate treatments. Whether this was actually better for your health is debatable.
More treatment often meant more bloodletting, more purging, more elaborate drug regimens, all of which could weaken an already sick body. There's a reason historians have speculated that many historical figures might have lived longer if their physicians had simply left them alone. But in the hospital, you wouldn't have that dubious privilege. You'd see the physician rarely, if ever. Your care would be in the hands of the brothers and sisters who staffed the wards, people who combined genuine compassion with profound medical ignorance, and who would do their best to keep you comfortable while God and nature fought over your fate. So, as the physician sweeps through the ward, robes rustling, eyes briefly scanning your pallid face before moving on to the next patient, you realize the truth of your situation. The most educated person in this building knows less about how your body actually works than a modern high school biology student, and he's absolutely certain he knows everything. That confidence is about to become very dangerous for you.
Let's talk about bloodletting, shall we? Because nothing says medieval medicine quite like the belief that the best way to cure almost any illness is to open up a vein and let the life slowly drain out of you. If you thought your fever was bad, wait until you're weak from blood loss and fighting off infection from the incision site. That's what medieval doctors called progress. Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, was the most common medical treatment in the medieval world. Prescribed for everything from headaches to plague, from melancholy to fever, from broken bones to the common cold. The logic, such as it was, derived from the humoral theory. If illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, and if blood was the most abundant and accessible of those fluids, then removing some blood would naturally restore balance and allow the body to heal. There was even a specific anatomy to the practice. Different veins were believed to connect to different organs and conditions. A headache might require bleeding from the forehead. Liver problems might call for opening a vein in the right arm. Female troubles demanded attention to veins in the ankles or feet. The physician would consult his charts, consider your symptoms, check the astrological conditions, and then prescribe bleeding from a specific location in a specific amount at a specific time. The actual procedure could be performed by several different practitioners. Physicians rarely did the cutting themselves, considering it beneath their dignity. Instead, they left the hands-on work to surgeons, barbers, or, in hospitals, to whoever happened to be available with a sharp instrument. Barbers were particularly common bloodletters, which is why the traditional barber's pole features red and white stripes representing blood and bandages. The tools of the trade included lancets, sharp-pointed instruments for opening veins, and the fleam, a device with a spring-loaded blade that could be struck with a mallet to make a quick incision. Some practitioners preferred a technique called cupping, where heated glass cups were placed on the skin to create suction, drawing blood to the surface and sometimes through small incisions. Then there was wet cupping and dry cupping and various regional variations that all amounted to the same basic idea: get the blood out. The amount of blood taken varied depending on the condition and the practitioner's judgment. For minor ailments, a few ounces might be considered sufficient. For serious illness, the physician might prescribe draining a pint or more. Historical accounts describe patients losing so much blood that they fainted, which was sometimes considered a sign that enough had been taken. Modern medicine recognizes that healthy adults have about 10 pints of blood and can lose perhaps 2 pints before entering dangerous territory. Medieval physicians had no such precise understanding, and overdoing it was common. And here's where the medieval hospital becomes a particularly dangerous place. In a setting where bloodletting was practiced on multiple patients, often with the same instruments, and where sanitation was not a concept anyone had fully grasped, the opportunities for spreading infection were enormous. The lancet that opened one patient's vein might carry disease to the next. The bleeding site itself could become infected.
A patient who entered the hospital with one condition might leave with bloodstream infections that would kill them far more efficiently than their original ailment. The timing of bloodletting was also considered crucial. Astrological considerations played a role, with certain days and certain planetary alignments considered favorable or unfavorable for the procedure. There were also religious considerations. Some days were inappropriate for bleeding because they were feast days or fast days. Monasteries sometimes scheduled bloodletting sessions for their monks, and the days following were treated as rest periods, when the weakened brothers were excused from their usual duties. Leeches were the more sophisticated alternative to direct incision. Medical leeches were specially bred and kept in hospital apothecaries, their segmented bodies writhing in jars until needed. The leech would be placed on the skin, allowed to bite and attach, and left there until it had drunk its fill of blood and dropped off naturally, satisfied and bloated. The advantages of leeches included a more gradual blood loss, and the alleged medical benefits of the leech's saliva, which contain anticoagulant compounds. In practice, leeches were applied to various parts of the body depending on the condition being treated. Hemorrhoids might warrant leeches applied to the relevant area. Eye problems could be addressed by placing leeches around the eyes. One medieval text recommends up to 30 leeches for a severe fever, though how anyone survived such treatment is a mystery best left to faith. The aftermath of bloodletting required care as well. The wound needed to be bandaged and kept clean, though medieval ideas about cleanliness were, to put it gently, less rigorous than modern standards. Patients were usually advised to rest and eat light, strengthening foods to help their bodies recover. The fact that bleeding made patients weaker was acknowledged, but interpreted as evidence that the bad blood had been removed and the body was now in a state where proper healing could begin. Of course, many patients did not recover after bloodletting. They grew weaker instead of stronger, developed fevers from infected wounds, or simply bled to death when enthusiastic practitioners took more than the body could spare. These failures were not attributed to the treatment itself. The patient had been too sick to be saved. The stars had been unfavorable. God had called them home. The theory was never questioned, only the circumstances of its application. So as you lie in your hospital bed, watching the barber approach with his gleaming lancet and his air of professional confidence, you face a choice that really isn't a choice at all. You can submit to the treatment your physician has prescribed, losing blood you need and risking infection you can't afford, or you can refuse and be labeled difficult, ungrateful, or worse, be accused of interfering with God's healing work. Either way, the system has decided what's best for you, and the system is almost certainly wrong. Roll up your sleeve, try not to look, and pray that whoever's holding that blade has at least washed their hands this week. They haven't. But pray anyway.
If bloodletting doesn't fix you, and let's be honest, it won't, there's always the medieval pharmacy. This is where your physician's learning really shines, as he prescribes elaborate concoctions made from ingredients that range from the merely useless to the actively poisonous. Welcome to the apothecary, where the line between medicine and murder is surprisingly thin. The medieval pharmacy was stocked with hundreds of different substances, organized according to their perceived effects on the four humors. There were warming medicines and cooling medicines, drying medicines and moistening medicines. There were simples, made from a single ingredient, and compounds, elaborate mixtures that might contain dozens of different components. Some of these ingredients were common herbs that you might find in any garden. Others were rare imports from the far ends of the known world. And some were things that no sane modern person would consider putting anywhere near their body. Let's start with the herbs, because those are the most defensible. Medieval practitioners did know something about herbal medicine, even if their theoretical understanding was flawed. Willow bark was used for fever and pain, and it genuinely contains salicylic acid, a compound related to aspirin. Poppy was used for pain relief and sleep, and it genuinely contains opium. St. John's wort was used for melancholy, and modern research suggests it might actually have mild antidepressant effects. Mint was used for digestive complaints, and mint still has a place in modern medicine for similar purposes. But these effective treatments were mixed in with a vast quantity of useless or harmful substances. Medieval medicine was also big on purging, both from above and below. Emetics would make you vomit. Purgatives would clean you out from the other end. The theory was that these treatments expelled corrupt humors and cleansed the body of disease. The practice was often a week or more of violent illness that left patients dehydrated, malnourished, and weaker than before. Common purgative ingredients included mercury, antimony, and various plant extracts that modern medicine recognizes as toxic. Mercury was particularly popular, used both internally and externally for a variety of conditions. It had the advantage of producing dramatic symptoms, lots of salivation and sweating, which practitioners interpreted as evidence that the treatment was working. The disadvantage was mercury poisoning, which could cause neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. Then there were the animal-based medicines. Variac, one of the most famous and expensive medieval preparations, was a complex mixture said to include dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh. Originally developed as an antidote to poison, Theriac eventually became a cure-all prescribed for everything from plague to indigestion. Whether any particular batch of Theriac contained actual viper flesh or just whatever the apothecary had on hand is a question historians have debated. But patients certainly believed they were getting the good stuff when they paid premium prices for this wonder drug. Other animal products in the medieval pharmacy included musk, ambergris, crushed pearls, and various glandular secretions. Horn from unicorns, actually rhinoceros or narwhal horn, was believed to detect and neutralize poison. Ground mummy, yes, actual Egyptian mummy, was prescribed for various conditions and was a significant enough trade item that counterfeiting became common. The idea of consuming human remains for medical purposes seems ghoulish to us, but in an era when medical theory was disconnected from biological reality, nothing was too bizarre to try. The hospital apothecary, if the hospital was well-funded enough to have one, would maintain stores of common ingredients and prepare medicines according to the physician's prescriptions. In poorer hospitals, the preparation of medicines fell to whatever brother or sister had been assigned the task, working from recipe books that had been copied and recopied over generations, accumulating errors and misunderstandings along the way. Medicines were administered in various forms. Syrups were popular for their relative palatability. Powders could be mixed with food or drink. Pills were made by combining medicinal substances with honey or other binding agents. Plasters and poultices were applied externally to affected areas. Enemas and suppositories provided alternative routes of administration when patients couldn't or wouldn't take medicines by mouth.
The taste of most medieval medicines was, by all accounts, horrific. This was sometimes considered a feature rather than a bug, under the theory that medicine should be unpleasant and that suffering was part of the healing process. Patients who complained about the taste were told to offer up their discomfort as a prayer. Those who vomited their medicine might have it administered again, or might be given additional treatments to settle their stomach first. One particularly unsettling category of medieval medicine was excrement-based treatments. Human and animal feces appeared in various medical recipes, applied externally for wounds or taken internally for other conditions. Urine also had medicinal applications. While modern readers might recoil in disgust, these treatments weren't entirely irrational by medieval standards. Feces and urine were believed to contain the essence of whatever had been consumed, and they were certainly always available, even when other medical supplies were scarce. Gold and precious stones were also prescribed, particularly for wealthy patients who could afford them. Ground gold was believed to strengthen the heart. Powdered gemstones were incorporated into medicines for various conditions. These treatments probably did no harm, since the quantities involved were too small to be toxic, but they were phenomenally expensive and no more effective than any other placebo.
In the hospital setting, you would likely receive whatever medicines were available and affordable. The expensive imports and precious metals were for private patients with deep pockets. Hospital patients got the basic preparations, heavily herbal, possibly effective by accident, probably useless, and occasionally dangerous. If you were lucky, your medicine might actually help. If you were unlucky, it might hasten your end. So, as the sister approaches your bed with a cup of something that looks like swamp water and smells like rotting vegetation mixed with horse urine, which it might actually contain, you have a decision to make. You can drink it and hope for the best. You can refuse it and face the consequences of medical disobedience. Or you can pretend to drink it and surreptitiously pour it out when no one's looking. That last option has a long and honorable history, by the way. Medieval patients weren't stupid. They might not have understood medical theory, but they could tell when a treatment was making them feel worse. The survival strategies of medieval patients, hiding medicines, feigning sleep when treatments were due, and quietly disobeying medical instructions may have saved more life than any physician's prescription. Drink up, and try not to think too hard about what's in it. If the medicines don't work and the bleeding doesn't help, there's always surgery. And by surgery, I mean a terrifying ordeal performed by someone with limited anatomical knowledge, no anesthesia worth the name, and tools that look like they belong in a torture chamber. Welcome to the operating theater, where the screams of patients provide the soundtrack and survival is a pleasant surprise. Let's get one thing clear from the start. Surgery in the medieval hospital was a last resort, performed only when all other options had failed and when the alternative was certain death. The risks were enormous, the pain was indescribable, and the outcomes were frequently tragic. Surgeons knew this, patients knew this, everyone involved understood that opening up the human body was a gamble with very bad odds. The surgeons themselves occupied a curious position in the medieval medical hierarchy. They were considered lower in status than physicians, who dealt in theory and diagnosis and rarely dirtied their hands with actual treatment. Surgeons were craftsmen, trained through apprenticeship rather than university education, and their work was seen as more mechanical than intellectual. Yet surgeons often had far more practical knowledge of human anatomy than physicians, simply because their work required them to look inside bodies, while physicians only speculated about what was there. In England, surgeons were formally affiliated with barbers through the Worshipful Company of Barbers, later the Company of Barber Surgeons. Both professions worked with sharp instruments, and both had regular access to the bodies of clients. The distinction between a barber who might extract a tooth or drain an abscess and a surgeon who might amputate a limb was a matter of degree rather than kind. In smaller communities, the same person might perform both roles. The tools of medieval surgery were impressive in their way, finely crafted implements of steel that would not look entirely out of place in a modern operating room. There were scalpels for incisions, saws for amputations, probes for exploring wounds, forceps for extraction, needles and thread to close incisions. What was missing was any reliable way to prevent pain, prevent infection, or prevent bleeding. For pain, medieval surgeons had a few options, none of them good. Alcohol could dull the senses somewhat. Opium and other narcotic plants could provide some relief. A few practitioners experimented with what they called soporific sponges, sponges soaked in a mixture of opium, mandrake, hemlock, and other substances and held under the patient's nose. These might have provided some sedation, but nothing approaching the complete unconsciousness that modern anesthesia provides. For most surgical patients, the experience was one of full consciousness and full sensation while someone cut into their body. To deal with the pain, surgeons relied on speed, strength, and restraints. A fast surgeon was a good surgeon, able to complete an amputation in minutes rather than prolonged agony.
Strong assistants would hold the patient down, sometimes strapping them to the operating table to prevent dangerous movement during the procedure. Some surgeons kept a stick or a piece of leather for the patient to bite on, both to prevent them from biting their tongue and to give them something to focus on besides the pain. Infection was an even greater killer than the immediate trauma of surgery. Medieval surgeons had no concept of germs or sterile technique. Instruments were wiped clean between patients, but not sterilized. Surgeons' hands were washed, but not disinfected. The operating environment was whatever space happened to be available, often no cleaner than any other room in the hospital. Wounds were closed with stitches, packed with dressings, and then left to heal or fester as fate and the patient's constitution determined. The wound dressings themselves were a subject of medical debate. Some practitioners favored keeping wounds dry and covered. Others believed in pouring wine, oil, or various medicinal preparations into the wound. The famous medieval surgeon Henri de Mondevier argued for clean wound treatment and primary closure, which was actually good advice, but his views were controversial and not universally followed. Many surgeons believed that pus formation was a necessary part of healing, speaking of laudable pus as a sign that the wound was progressing properly. From a modern perspective, pus is a sign of infection, exactly what you don't want. Bleeding during surgery was controlled through a combination of cauterization and compression. Hot irons could be applied to bleeding vessels to seal them shut, a procedure that was agonizing but effective. Ligatures, threads tied around blood vessels, were also used, though not as routinely as they would be in later centuries. Tourniquets could reduce blood flow to limbs during amputation. But controlling bleeding was an imprecise art, and many patients died from blood loss on the operating table. The types of surgery performed in medieval hospitals were limited by these constraints. External procedures were most common, treating wounds, draining abscesses, removing tumors visible on the body's surface. Amputations were performed when limbs were too damaged to save. Trepanning, drilling holes in the skull, was an ancient practice still occasionally used for head injuries or to release evil spirits. More ambitious internal surgeries were rare and usually fatal. Opening the abdomen was almost always a death sentence, since there was no way to prevent the infection that would inevitably follow. Surgeons understood this and generally refused to attempt such procedures. The famous surgeon Guy de Chauliac listed surgeries that should not be attempted because they were beyond the art's capabilities, a recognition that medieval surgery had definite limits. In hospital settings, surgery would be performed when necessary, usually in a dedicated space that could be cleaned afterwards, though cleaning meant something different in an era without antiseptics. The patient would be prepared as best as possible, perhaps given something for pain, certainly given spiritual preparation through prayer and last rites just in case. Then the cutting would begin. If you were a hospital patient facing surgery, your chances of survival depended on many factors. The nature of the procedure mattered. A simple abscess drainage had much better odds than a limb amputation. The skill of the surgeon mattered. Experienced practitioners had developed techniques that minimized trauma and bleeding. Your overall health mattered. A strong young person could survive what would kill an elderly or weakened patient. And luck mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. So, as the surgeon approaches your bed, rolling up his sleeves and gesturing for his assistants to hold you down, you understand what you're facing. There will be pain like nothing you've experienced before. There will be blood and noise and the sickening sounds of your own body being cut open. And if you survive the procedure itself, there will be days or weeks of waiting to see whether infection takes hold. The surgeon meets your eyes. He's not cruel. He knows what he's about to put you through, and he's genuinely trying to save your life. But he's working with tools and techniques that guarantee suffering, in a world where the germ theory of disease is still 5 centuries away. Close your eyes, say your prayers, and try to remember that the alternative to this horror was dying of whatever brought you here in the first place. Sometimes there are no good choices, only choices.
Now let's meet the people who will actually be taking care of you day by day, hour by hour, while the physicians theorize and the surgeons cut. The nursing staff of a medieval hospital are the unsung heroes and occasional villains of your recovery story. They're the ones who will feed you, clean you, pray over you, and possibly steal your last coins when you're not looking. Welcome to your new family. In most medieval hospitals, the nursing care was provided by members of religious orders. These were monks and nuns, brothers and sisters who had dedicated their lives to God and who expressed that dedication through service to the sick and poor. Their motivations were genuine, their compassion often real, and their medical knowledge almost entirely lacking. What they offered was not medical expertise, but something arguably more valuable: presence, consistency, and care. The organizational structure varied between institutions. Some hospitals were run by established monastic orders, like the Augustinians or Benedictines. Others were staffed by specialized orders dedicated specifically to hospital work, such as the Hospitallers or the Brothers of the Holy Spirit. Some employed lay people alongside religious brothers and sisters, creating a mixed workforce of dedicated believers and ordinary workers. The sisters who staffed female-run hospitals like the Hôtel Dieu in Paris followed strict rules of religious life even while caring for patients. They rose before dawn for prayers, observed periods of silence, wore habits that marked them as women apart from the world, and balanced their duties to God with their duties to the sick. For many, the two were inseparable. Caring for the sick was worship. The suffering patient was Christ in disguise, and service to them was service to Him. The daily routine of hospital care began early. Patients needed to be fed, washed, and have their bedding changed. Wounds needed to be dressed, chamber pots emptied, and the dead removed before their presence upset the living patients too badly. The sisters and brothers who performed these tasks did so without complaint, or at least without complaint that was recorded, treating the most unpleasant duties as opportunities for spiritual growth. The feeding of patients was a significant undertaking. Hospital kitchens operated on a large scale, preparing meals for dozens or hundreds of patients, depending on the institution's size. The food was simple but intended to be nourishing: bread, pottage, occasionally meat or fish, and ale or wine to drink. Special diets might be prepared for patients with particular conditions, following the physician's instructions about warming or cooling foods appropriate to their humoral imbalance. Feeding patients who couldn't feed themselves required patience and skill. Those too weak to sit up needed to be propped and supported. Those who couldn't swallow solid food needed broths and liquids. Those who refused to eat, whether from despair or delirium, needed coaxing and sometimes force. The sisters became adept at these challenges, developing techniques passed down through generations of caregivers. Bathing and hygiene were handled according to the standards of the time, which is to say, not terribly well by modern measures. Full baths were rare and believed by some physicians to be dangerous for sick patients, opening the pores and allowing disease to enter. More common was sponging, wiping down patients with cloths dampened with water or herbal infusions. The goal was to keep patients reasonably clean and comfortable, not to achieve anything like modern standards of hygiene. Changing bedding and linens was an ongoing battle against the inevitable accumulation of bodily fluids, vermin, and general filth. Clean linens were a luxury in many hospitals, and sheets might be shared between patients or only changed when absolutely necessary. The straw in mattresses harbored fleas and lice, and periodic replacement was the only real solution, though one that many hospitals couldn't afford to implement frequently. Wound care fell to the nursing staff under the direction of physicians or surgeons. Sisters learned to change bandages, apply poultices, and recognize the signs of healing or deterioration. They became skilled at managing pain within their limited means, offering comfort and distraction when medicine couldn't provide relief. They learned which wounds were likely to heal and which were going to kill, and they learned to prepare patients and families for both outcomes. The spiritual care of patients was considered at least as important as their physical care. The nursing staff led prayers at appointed hours, encouraged patients in their devotions, and summoned priests when death seemed near. Last rites were crucial service, ensuring that dying patients had confessed to their sins, received communion, and been anointed in preparation for their journey to the afterlife. No one wanted to die unshriven, and the hospital staff took their responsibility for patients' souls seriously. Not all nursing staff were equally devoted or competent. Like any profession, medieval nursing had its share of lazy, careless, and even cruel practitioners. Some staff stole from patients, some neglected their duties, some treated patients with contempt rather than compassion. Hospital administrators tried to maintain discipline through rules and supervision, but enforcement was inconsistent, and patients who complained might find their complaints ignored or punished.
The hierarchy among hospital staff created its own tensions. Senior brothers and sisters had authority over junior members, and the division of labor could be contentious. The most unpleasant tasks, cleaning chamber pots, washing soiled linens, and caring for the most difficult patients, tended to fall to the lowest-ranking staff. Those with seniority might spend their time in supervision, teaching, or caring for the more presentable patients. Lay staff, when employed, occupied an even lower position. These were workers hired for wages rather than serving for religious reasons, and they might include kitchen staff, laundry workers, and general laborers. Their commitment to patient care was, presumably, less fervent than that of religious brothers and sisters, though generalizations are dangerous. Some lay workers were devoted caregivers. Some religious staff were merely going through the motions. The emotional demands of hospital work were enormous. Staff witnessed death on a regular basis, often the deaths of people they had come to know and care for during long stays. They dealt with suffering that they couldn't relieve, with patients who were frightened and angry and in pain. They worked long hours in difficult conditions, exposed to whatever diseases their patients carried, and many of them sickened and died themselves. Yet there was also satisfaction in the work. The religious framework gave meaning to the suffering, both the patients and the caregivers. Those who survived credited God and his earthly servants, and the gratitude of recovered patients was a reward that transcended any earthly payment. The community of hospital staff provided companionship and support, and the routine of daily care provided structure and purpose. So as you lie in your hospital bed, watching the sisters move through the ward with their baskets and their prayers, you begin to understand your situation. These women, these men in their rough habits and their calloused hands, they are your lifeline. They may not understand medicine. They may follow instructions that are doing you more harm than good. But they are here, day after day, night after night, caring for you because they believe it matters, because they believe you matter. In an age when the sick were often abandoned, when disease was seen as divine punishment, when the poor died in ditches and doorways, these hospitals and these caregivers represented something radical. The belief that every suffering person deserved care. The belief that nursing the sick was holy work. The belief that even in the face of death, there was something meaningful to be done. They're not perfect. They can't save you. But they'll stay with you until the end, whatever that end might be. And in the medieval world, that's not nothing. Let's talk about your neighbors, the people sharing this space with you, breathing the same air, listening to the same prayers, and waiting alongside you to see whether they'll walk out of here or be carried out. The patient population of a medieval hospital is a cross-section of society's unfortunates, united only by their bad luck and their desperate need for somewhere to be sick. The first thing you'll notice is the variety. Medieval hospitals didn't specialize the way modern medical facilities do. There was no separate ward for infectious diseases, no isolation for contagious patients, no distinction between surgical cases and medical cases. Everyone was mixed together, the feverish next to the wounded, the plague-stricken next to the merely malnourished. If you came in with one condition, you had an excellent chance of leaving with several more, assuming you left at all. Hospitals served multiple populations. There were the genuinely ill, people suffering from diseases, injuries, or other medical conditions. There were the elderly and infirm, people who couldn't care for themselves and had no family to help. There were the poor, people who were sick primarily from malnutrition, exposure, and the general hardships of poverty. And there were the dying, people for whom the hospital was not a place of treatment, but a place to wait for the end. The pilgrims deserve special mention. Many medieval hospitals were located along pilgrimage routes, providing shelter and care for travelers making their way to holy sites. A pilgrim might arrive exhausted, footsore, and susceptible to whatever illness was going around. The hospital would take them in, treat their immediate needs, and send them on their way when they were well enough to travel. For these temporary visitors, the hospital was a way station, not a destination. The mixture of patients created obvious problems. A pilgrim with a twisted ankle might find herself lying next to someone with dysentery. A young man recovering from a wound might catch the fever from his elderly neighbor. The hospitals understood this risk in a general way, but without germ theory, there was no systematic approach to preventing the spread of disease. Isolation was occasional and inconsistent, reserved for patients who were obviously contagious or whose symptoms were too disturbing for others to witness. The plague years made this mixing particularly deadly. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, hospitals became death traps. Patients came in with all manner of complaints and were exposed to the plague by their fellow sufferers. Staff sickened and died alongside those they were trying to help. Some hospitals were overwhelmed, their beds filled and overflowing, their resources exhausted, their staff either dead or fled. Others simply closed their doors, unable to cope with the scale of death. But the plague was exceptional. In ordinary times, the hospital's patient population was more manageable, if no less varied. You might find yourself lying next to a merchant's apprentice who had been kicked by a horse. On your other side might be an old woman, too frail to live alone. Her children dead or distant, her only refuge this religious institution that would care for her until the end. Across the ward might be a soldier recovering from battle wounds, his arm still bandaged, his eyes still haunted by what he'd seen. The social mixing of the hospital was unusual for medieval society. Outside these walls, people lived and died within their social stations, rarely interacting with those above or below them. Inside, the beds were arranged by need rather than status. A nobleman might find himself next to a beggar. A priest might share a ward with a prostitute. The hospital stripped away the normal markers of status and left everyone equally vulnerable, equally dependent on the care of others. This mixing created its own social dynamics. Some patients formed friendships, supporting each other through long recoveries. Others formed enmities, quarreling over blankets, food, or perceived slights. The constant proximity of death created a kind of gallows humor, and patients who were well enough to talk might swap stories, share gossip, or simply complain together about the quality of the pottage. Those who were too sick to interact became the background of hospital life. The moaning of patients in pain, the cries of the delirious, the rattling breath of the dying. These formed a constant soundtrack that the other patients learned to ignore, more or less. Sleep was difficult when your neighbor was screaming, but exhaustion eventually overcame even the worst disturbances. The presence of the dying was a constant reminder of what might be coming. When a patient died, the body would be prepared and removed, ideally quickly enough that the other patients wouldn't have to lie next to a corpse for long. Last rites would be administered if there was time, prayers said for the departing soul. Then the bed would be cleaned, more or less, and a new patient would take the place of the old. Some patients recovered and left. These were the success stories, proof that the hospital could actually help, that not everyone who entered was doomed. Recovered patients might leave with gratitude, with gifts for the staff if they could afford them, with prayers of thanks for their deliverance. They were the hospital's advertisements, proof that the institution served its stated purpose. Others left against medical advice, fleeing the hospital before their treatment was complete, preferring the risks of the outside world to the horrors within. These departures were generally discouraged, but there was little the hospital could do to prevent them short of physical restraint, which some institutions did occasionally employ. And many, of course, didn't leave at all. The hospital cemetery received a steady stream of residents, buried in consecrated ground, their graves marked or unmarked depending on the institution's resources and the deceased's status. For the poorest patients, a mass grave was the final destination, bodies laid together in shared rest as they had lain in shared sickness. So, as you look around the ward at your fellow patients, you see your possible futures. There's the man who seems to be improving, who might walk out of here in a week or two. There's the woman who's been here for months, neither improving nor declining, stuck in a limbo of chronic illness. There's the child in the corner bed, too quiet, too still, who probably won't see another sunrise. And there's you, wondering which of these paths you'll follow. The hospital doesn't promise to cure you. It promises to care for you while you cure yourself, or while you don't. It promises you won't be alone. It promises your soul will be tended, even if your body can't be saved. Looking at your neighbors, you begin to understand how much those promises are worth. Let's dive into what your physicians and caregivers actually believe is happening inside your body, because their understanding of disease is going to determine how they treat you, and their understanding is spectacularly, creatively, almost impressively wrong. Welcome to medieval pathology, where the explanations for illness are elaborate, internally consistent, and completely disconnected from biological reality. The foundation of medieval disease theory was the four humors we discussed earlier, but the application of this theory to specific illnesses created an entire worldview of sickness and health. Each humor corresponded to an element, earth, water, fire, or air. Each corresponded to a season, winter, spring, summer, or fall. Each corresponded to a time of life, childhood, youth, maturity, or old age. Each corresponded to a temperament, phlegmatic, sanguine, choleric, or melancholic. The entire cosmos was connected, and disease was a disruption of these cosmic harmonies playing out in the individual body. When you got sick, your physician would attempt to determine which humor was out of balance and why. This wasn't simply a matter of measuring something, since the humors couldn't be directly observed, only inferred from symptoms. A patient with a fever obviously had too much heat in their system, probably from an excess of blood or yellow bile, both hot humors. A patient with chills had too much cold, probably from phlegm or black bile. The physician's job was to read the symptoms like a text, interpreting the body's messages according to learned frameworks. Beyond humoral theory, medieval medicine recognized specific diseases, though not always the same diseases that modern medicine identifies. Leprosy was well known and greatly feared, leading to the isolation of sufferers in separate hospitals called laser houses. Plague or pestilence was recognized as a distinct and terrifying condition, though its causes were attributed to corrupt air, divine punishment, or astrological influences rather than bacteria. Consumption, what we would call tuberculosis, was understood as a wasting illness that gradually devoured the body. The theory of contagion was only partially developed. Medieval physicians understood that some diseases could spread from person to person. Leprosy was believed to spread through contact, which is why lepers were isolated. Plague was known to spread through communities in ways that suggested transmission between people. But the mechanism of this transmission was poorly understood. Without knowledge of germs, bacteria, or viruses, medieval thinkers attributed contagion to corrupt air, or miasma. to the influence of the sick person's gaze, or to more mystical causes like curses and demonic influence. The concept of miasma was particularly important. Bad air, carrying the essence of corruption and decay, was believed to cause many diseases. This explained why certain epidemics often struck crowded, filthy areas with poor ventilation. It explained why certain places seemed unhealthy, the swamps and marshes where fevers were common, the slums where the poor died in numbers. Miasma theory wasn't entirely wrong, since bad sanitation did correlate with disease, but the mechanism it proposed was completely incorrect. Astrological influences also played a role in medieval disease theory. The planets, particularly Saturn and Mars, were associated with specific illnesses and could predispose individuals to sickness when in unfavorable positions. The Black Death was famously attributed by some scholars to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, which had corrupted the air and set the stage for the pandemic. Individual horoscopes could reveal susceptibility to certain conditions, and prudent physicians would consider astrological factors in their diagnoses and treatments. Divine causation was always in the background and sometimes in the foreground. Disease could be punishment for sin, either individual sin or collective sin. The plagues and epidemics that swept through medieval Europe were often interpreted as God's judgment on a wicked world, calls to repentance and moral reform. This didn't mean that medical treatment was pointless, since God might work through physicians as instruments of mercy, but it did mean that spiritual remedies were always part of the therapeutic picture. Demonic influence was another possible cause of disease. Demons could cause illness directly, or they could work through witches and other human agents who had made pacts with the powers of darkness. Mental illness was particularly likely to be attributed to demonic possession, but physical illness could also have supernatural causes. The treatment for such conditions might include exorcism, prayer, pilgrimage to holy sites, or the application of sacred relics. Against this complex background of causes, diagnosis became an exercise in reading signs. The physician would examine you, ask you questions about your symptoms and their history, consider your age and sex and social position, consult astrological charts, and examine bodily products, especially urine, to build a picture of what was wrong. The diagnosis would then be expressed in humoral terms: excess or deficiency of particular qualities, corruption of particular organs or systems, disruption of the body's natural balance. This diagnosis would guide treatment. If you had too much heat, you needed cooling. If you had too much moisture, you needed drying. If blood had accumulated excessively, it needed to be let out. If your system was corrupted with bad humors, they needed to be purged. The treatments we've already discussed, bloodletting, purging, medicines, and surgery, were all directed toward restoring the balance that disease had disrupted. What's striking about medieval disease theory is how coherent it was internally. Given the premises, the conclusions followed logically. If the body contained 4 humors and health required their balance, then treatment should aim at restoring balance. If bad air caused disease, then avoiding bad air and purifying the air with pleasant smells made sense. If the stars influenced health, then consulting astrology before treatment was prudent. The system worked as a system. It just happened to be based on premises that were factually wrong. This meant that medieval physicians weren't stupid. They were working with the intellectual tools available to them, applying logic and observation within a framework that seemed to explain what they saw. When their treatments failed, they could attribute the failure to factors within the framework. The disease was too advanced, the stars were unfavorable, the patient's constitution was too weak. God had other plans. The framework was almost unfalsifiable, which is exactly why it persisted for so long. So as your physician delivers his diagnosis, explaining with great confidence that your illness results from an excess of choler that has corrupted your liver and heated your blood, you understand something important. He genuinely believes this. He has studied for years to reach these conclusions. His treatment recommendations follow logically from his premises, and he is almost certainly wrong about everything. Welcome to medieval medicine. The confidence is absolute. The knowledge is entirely theoretical. And your life depends on ideas that won't be corrected for another 5 centuries. Let's walk through a typical day in the medieval hospital, from the prayers that wake you before dawn to the uncomfortable attempt at sleep that ends it. Your time here is structured not by medical necessity, but by religious observance, with treatments and meals fitted into the gaps between prayers. Welcome to your new routine. The day begins in darkness. Long before dawn, a bell rings somewhere in the hospital complex, calling the religious staff to their first prayers of the day. The sound penetrates the ward, stirring patients from whatever rest they manage to achieve. Those who can rise are encouraged to do so for prayer. Those who cannot are expected at least to be awake and attentive, offering their suffering as a form of worship. The prayers follow the monastic pattern of the canonical hours: matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, and none through the morning and midday, vespers in the evening, and compline before sleep. Not every hospital observed all these hours with equal rigor, but the rhythm of prayer shaped the day for both staff and patients. The chapel was the heart of the hospital, and its schedule was the hospital's pulse. After the early prayers, there's a brief period of activity before breakfast. Chamber pots are emptied. Those patients who can wash themselves are given water, and those who cannot are tended to by the nursing staff. Fresh rushes might be spread on the floor. Windows are opened if the weather permits, letting in whatever fresh air is available. The ward takes on a hushed bustle as everyone prepares for the day. Breakfast, such as it is, arrives at a set time. For patients, this might be bread and ale, perhaps with a bit of cheese or leftover pottage from the previous day's dinner. Those on restricted diets, either because of medical orders or religious fasting, receive something different, or nothing at all. The nursing staff distribute the food, assist patients who need help eating, and try to coax the reluctant to take nourishment. Morning is the busiest time for medical treatments. The physician, if the hospital has one, and if he's visiting today, makes his rounds. He sweeps through the ward, examining patients who have been flagged for attention, consulting with the nursing staff, and adjusting treatment plans. For most patients, this means a few moments of scrutiny, a question or two, and then instructions left with the caregivers. For those being actively treated, it might mean bloodletting, medicines, or the changing of bandages. Between treatments, there's time for prayer, rest, and whatever diversions the hospital permits. Some patients can sit up, talk to their neighbors, or receive visitors, if any are allowed. Others lie in their beds, too sick or too weak to do anything but wait. The nursing staff move through the ward, checking on patients, responding to calls for help, and performing the endless small tasks of caregiving.
The main meal of the day comes in late morning or early afternoon, the timing varying by institution. This is the most substantial food patients will receive: pottage or stew, bread, and whatever meat or fish the hospital can provide. The quality and quantity depend on the hospital's resources and the patient's condition. Those recovering well might receive more generous portions. Those near death might receive only broth or nothing at all. Afternoon brings another round of treatments for those who need them: more prayers and the slow passage of time. The ward might quiet down as patients who can sleep take advantage of the relative calm. The nursing staff continue their rounds, but with less urgency than the morning.
There might be time for small acts of kindness, adjusting a pillow, bringing extra blankets, simply sitting with a patient who needs company. Visitors come during designated hours, if visitors are allowed at all. Some hospitals welcomed family and friends as important to patient morale. Others restricted access, either for the patient's protection or to maintain order in the wards. When visitors came, they brought news from the outside world, reassurance that the patient hadn't been forgotten, and sometimes gifts of food or money that could improve the patient's lot. Evening brings another meal, usually lighter than the midday dinner, and another round of prayers. As darkness falls, the hospital prepares for night. Candles are lit, sparingly, since they're expensive. Patients who can move might use the chamber pots one last time before settling in. The nursing staff make final rounds, checking on the sickest patients and ensuring everyone has what they need for the night. The night in a medieval hospital is long and often disturbed. Pain doesn't keep scheduled hours, and patients who were comfortable during the day might become restless or distressed as night deepens. The nursing staff maintain a presence through the night, though in smaller numbers than during the day. A single brother or sister might be responsible for an entire ward, responding to calls for help and monitoring the most critical patients. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of the ward, moaning, coughing, prayers muttered in the darkness, the occasional cry of someone whose pain has become unbearable. The bells continue their marking of the hours, calling the religious staff to their nighttime prayers and reminding the sleepless patients that they're not alone, that someone is awake and praying for them, even in the darkest hours. And then dawn approaches again, and the cycle begins anew. This rhythm, prayer and treatment, meals and rest, could continue for days, weeks, or months. Recovery was often slow, and hospitals didn't rush patients out the door the moment they showed improvement. Those who got better stayed until they were well enough to leave. Those who didn't get better stayed until they died. And those in between, neither improving nor declining, might remain for indefinite periods. Their beds, their homes, the ward, their world. The monotony was broken occasionally by significant events, a patient's death, a miraculous recovery, a visit from an important dignitary, a feast day that brought special foods and relaxed rules. But mostly, hospital life was routine. The same prayers, the same pottage, the same faces around you, day after day. It was boring. It was often miserable. But it was also a kind of community, a society of the suffering who shared their space and their fate. The bonds formed in hospital wards could be deep, the friendships forged in shared adversity strong enough to last if both parties survived. So, as you settled into this rhythm, counting the hours by bells and prayers, waiting for treatments that might help and might harm, you understand what hospital life really is. It's not dramatic, it's not exciting. It's a long, slow waiting game where time itself becomes the primary experience. And you wait. Let's talk about money, because even in an age of religious charity and sacred duty, someone has to pay for the beds, the bread, and the brothers who tend you. The economics of medieval hospitals were as complicated as any modern healthcare system, involving a web of donations, endowments, and political maneuvering that kept these institutions running, often by the thinnest of margins. The founding of a hospital was typically an act of charity by someone with resources to spare. A wealthy merchant might endow a hospital to care for the poor, both as an act of genuine compassion and as an investment in his own spiritual future. A nobleman might establish a hospital on his lands, providing for his tenants and demonstrating his Christian virtue. A bishop might found a hospital in his diocese, adding to the church's charitable infrastructure. The motivations were mixed.
combining genuine concern for the suffering with concerns about salvation, social status, and political advantage.
The initial endowment would typically include land, because land was the foundation of medieval wealth. The hospital would receive a grant of property, either the land on which it stood or other lands whose rents would support its operations. A well-endowed hospital might own several properties, farms, and urban buildings that generated income through rents and agricultural production. The larger hospitals could be substantial landowners, with economic interests that extended far beyond their immediate charitable mission. Beyond the initial endowment, hospitals depended on ongoing donations. The wealthy were encouraged to remember hospitals in their wills, leaving bequests that would support care for the poor and prayers for the donor's soul. These bequests might specify particular uses: money for medicines, funds for feeding patients, provisions for specific numbers of beds. Some donors established chantries within hospital chapels, paying for priests to say masses for their souls in perpetuity, which both benefited the donors spiritually and provided income to the hospital. Living donors also contributed, giving money, goods, or services during their lifetimes. Merchants might donate surplus goods. Farmers might provide food. Craftsmen might contribute their labor. The hospital received these gifts and worked to cultivate relationships with potential donors, since ongoing support was essential to operations. Hospital administrators became adept at fundraising, though they wouldn't have used that term. In some cases, hospitals received governmental support. A king might grant privileges to a hospital, exempting it from certain taxes or granting it monopolies on particular activities. A city might provide subsidies from public funds, recognizing the hospital's role in caring for urban poor who would otherwise crowd the streets. This public support was never systematic or reliable, but it could make a significant difference to an institution's finances. Patients themselves sometimes paid for their care, though this depended greatly on the hospital's mission and the patient's means. Some hospitals were explicitly for the poor and charged nothing. Others operated on a sliding scale, with wealthy patients paying fees that helped subsidize care for the poor. A few institutions catered primarily to paying patients, functioning more like private clinics than charitable hospitals. In practice, many hospitals used a mix of these approaches, accepting whoever came through their doors and charging what they could get. The internal economy of the hospital was managed by officials who might or might not have any financial training. The master or warden of the hospital had overall responsibility, but the actual bookkeeping might fall to a variety of staff members. Income and expenses were tracked, at least in theory, but accounting practices varied widely. Some hospitals kept detailed records that survive to this day. Others operated in financial chaos, their administrators more concerned with spiritual matters than with balancing ledgers. Expenses were substantial and largely fixed. Staff needed to be housed and fed, whether or not donations were flowing. Buildings needed maintenance. Food needed to be purchased or produced. Medical supplies, as they were, needed to be procured. The temptation to cut corners was ever present, and the quality of care could suffer when finances were tight. Corruption was a constant risk. Hospital administrators controlled valuable resources and had opportunities for self-dealing. Properties could be leased to family members at below-market rates. Supplies could be diverted for personal use. Staff positions could be filled based on patronage rather than qualification. The church and secular authorities tried to provide oversight, but abuses were common enough that reformers regularly complained about the mismanagement of charitable institutions. Some hospitals failed financially and either closed or were absorbed by larger institutions. Others accumulated wealth over time, their endowments growing and their operations expanding. The most successful hospitals became powerful institutions in their own right, with economic and political influence that extended far beyond their immediate charitable mission. The relationship between money and mission was always complicated. On the one hand, hospitals needed resources to operate, and securing those resources required attention to the concerns of donors and patrons.
On the other hand, the pursuit of resources could distract from or even undermine the charitable mission. A hospital that catered too much to wealthy donors might neglect poor patients. An institution focused on accumulating property might lose sight of its healing purpose. So, as you lie in your hospital bed, receiving care that you probably aren't paying for directly, you're benefiting from an economic system that has been generations in the making. Someone's grandmother left money in her will. Someone's ancestor granted land. Someone is praying for the soul of a merchant who died a century ago, and that merchant's bequest is paying for your bread. The economics of medieval charity were different from modern healthcare financing, but they faced similar challenges. How to fund care for those who couldn't pay. How to maintain quality when resources were scarce. How to balance mission with institutional survival. The answers were imperfect then, as they remain imperfect now. At least in the medieval hospital, nobody is going to hand you a bill.
Let's talk about the end. Because for many patients, the medieval hospital was not a place of healing, but a place of dying. The care for the dying was, in some ways, the hospital's most important function, and it was performed with a seriousness and a ritual that modern medicine often lacks. Death in the medieval hospital was not a medical failure, but a spiritual transition, and the hospital's job was to prepare you for the journey. The signs of approaching death were well known to experienced caregivers. A certain pallor, a particular pattern of breathing, a withdrawal from the world of the living that became visible before the final departure. The nursing staff, who saw death regularly, could usually tell when a patient was entering their final hours or days. When these signs appeared, the hospital shifted its attention from treatment to preparation. The first priority was spiritual. A priest would be summoned to hear the dying patient's final confession, absolving them of sins so they could meet God with a clean conscience. This was not a formality, but a matter of eternal consequence. To die unconfessed was to risk damnation, and both patients and caregivers took this seriously. If no priest was available, a layperson might hear the confession in emergency, though formal absolution required clerical authority. After confession came communion, the receipt of the consecrated bread and wine that were believed to be the actual body and blood of Christ. This final communion, called viaticum, meaning provision for the journey, was spiritual food for the passage from life to death. Receiving it was a sign that death was expected and accepted, that the patient was prepared to meet their Maker. The sacrament of extreme unction, or last anointing, came next. A priest would anoint the dying person with holy oil on their eyes, ears, nostrils, mouth, hands, and feet, praying over each anointing for forgiveness of sins committed through that sense or limb. This ritual, later called the last rites, was believed to confer grace and prepare the soul for its departure from the body. With the spiritual preparations complete, the focus shifted to comfort and companionship. The dying were not left alone. Family members might be summoned if time permitted and if they could reach the hospital. In their absence, the nursing staff would provide vigil, sitting with the dying patient, holding their hand, praying with them, simply being present as they made the final passage. Prayers for the dying followed specific formulas. The litany of the saints called upon holy intercessors to accompany the departing soul. Psalms were recited, especially the penitential psalms that expressed sorrow for sin and trust in God's mercy. The commendation of the dying placed the soul in God's hands, asking for safe passage through whatever trials awaited after death. The moment of death itself was watched for carefully. The cessation of breathing, the stillness that replaced struggle, the particular quality of silence that followed a life's end. These signs were noted, and the time of death recorded if records were kept. Prayers continued after death, shifting to intercession for the departed soul now beginning its journey. The body required preparation. It would be washed, a final act of care for a vessel that had housed an immortal soul. Eyes and mouth would be closed, if they hadn't closed naturally.
The body would be wrapped in a shroud, usually a simple cloth, though wealthier patients might have more elaborate provisions. In some hospitals, the body would be placed in the chapel for a period before burial, allowing for vigil and prayers. Burial followed, usually quickly, since medieval people didn't have the technology to preserve bodies and didn't see any reason to delay the return of the flesh to earth. Hospital cemeteries received the dead, their graves marked or unmarked according to custom and resources. Prayers would be said at the graveside, commending the body to the earth and the soul to God. The funeral mass, if there was one, would be said in the hospital chapel, another opportunity for the community to pray for the departed. But the relationship between the hospital and its dead didn't end with burial. Masses would continue to be said for the souls of deceased patients, part of the ongoing cycle of prayer that was the hospital's spiritual work. Donors who had funded the hospital were remembered in prayers for the dead. The living and the dead remained connected in a web of spiritual obligation. For patients who died in the hospital, there was comfort in knowing they would not die alone or unprepared. The terror of sudden death, of being struck down without confession or communion, was a real and constant fear in medieval life. The hospital offered protection against this fear. Whatever else it couldn't do, it could ensure that death, when it came properly, with all the spiritual preparations that the Church deemed necessary. This emphasis on spiritual preparation might seem alien to modern readers, for whom death is primarily a medical event rather than a religious one. But for medieval people, the manner of dying mattered enormously, perhaps more than the manner of living. A good death, well prepared and properly accompanied, could redeem a troubled life. A bad death, sudden and unshriven, could cast a shadow over even a virtuous existence. So, as you lie in your bed, aware that the treatments aren't working, feeling your strength fade day by day, you understand that the hospital hasn't failed you. It has done what it promised to do. It has cared for you while there was hope of recovery, and now, as hope fades,
It will care for you as you die. It will prepare your soul, accompany your passage, and remember you in prayers after you're gone. In the medieval hospital, death is not defeat. It's the final service the institution can offer, and it's offered with all the seriousness and devotion that the living can muster for the dying. Close your eyes. Let the prayers wash over you, and know that whatever comes next, you won't face it alone. Now, let's talk about what happened when the ordinary horror of medieval healthcare met something extraordinary. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, and within a few years, it had killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population. The hospitals, already struggling to provide care with inadequate resources and mistaken theories, were overwhelmed by a catastrophe that made everything they didn't know about medicine suddenly and terrifyingly relevant. The plague arrived by ship, carried by rats and their fleas from the trading posts of the Black Sea. It spread through port cities first, Messina and Genoa and Venice, then inland along trade routes and pilgrimage paths. By 1348, it had reached France, Spain, and England. By 1350, it had swept through most of Europe, leaving devastation in its wake. The symptoms were unmistakable and terrifying. Victims developed painful swellings in their lymph nodes, the characteristic buboles that gave the bubonic plague its name. Black patches appeared on the skin as tissue died. Fever spiked to dangerous levels. Those who developed pneumonic plague, with the infection in their lungs, coughed blood and were dead within days. The smell of death was everywhere, so pervasive that some believed the very air had become poisonous. Medieval medicine had no answer to this catastrophe. Physicians applied their humoral theories, recommending bloodletting, purging, and the avoidance of bad air. They prescribed aromatic substances to ward off the miasma they believed carried the disease. They consulted their astrological charts and found dire conjunctions that explained, retroactively, why the pestilence had come. None of it helped. The treatments that were useless against ordinary illness were equally useless against plague, and the confident theories of learned men meant nothing against the disease that killed without regard to humors or horoscopes. Hospitals faced impossible choices. They could open their doors to plague victims and watch the disease spread through their wards, killing patients and staff alike, or they could close their doors and abandon the sick to die in the streets. Some hospitals attempted isolation, keeping plague patients separate from other sufferers, but the mechanism of transmission wasn't understood, and these measures were largely ineffective. The staff of hospitals died in horrifying numbers. Monks and nuns who had dedicated their lives to caring for the sick now found themselves among the victims. In some institutions, the entire staff was wiped out, leaving patients to die untended and the hospital to fall into ruin. Those who survived often fled, their courage finally broken by a disease that seemed to show no mercy to anyone, however devout or dedicated. The social fabric of care collapsed along with the institutions. Families abandoned sick members, afraid to be in the same house with the dying. Priests refused to hear confessions or administer last rites, unwilling to approach the infected. Gravediggers couldn't keep up with the dead, and bodies piled up in streets and houses, their decay adding to the pestilential air that everyone feared. Some caregivers stayed at their posts either from faith or fatalism or simple inability to imagine doing otherwise. These plague doctors became figures of both reverence and horror, their continued presence among the dying marking them as either saints or suicides. Some survived, developing what modern medicine would recognize as immunity. Many didn't. The aftermath of the plague reshaped medieval medicine and medieval hospitals. The massive death toll created labor shortages that changed economic relationships across Europe. The failure of conventional medicine to prevent or cure the plague opened space for new approaches and new skepticism about traditional authorities. The religious explanation that the plague was divine punishment led to increased piety and, paradoxically, increased doubt about a God who could inflict such suffering on his creation. Hospitals that survived the plague years emerged into a changed world. The population they served was smaller, but potentially more prosperous, as resources that had been spread among many were now concentrated in fewer hands. The labor shortage meant that even the poor had more bargaining power. The traumatic experience of the plague left permanent marks on institutional memory, with protocols for dealing with pestilence becoming part of the standard operational knowledge. But the fundamental problems of medieval medicine remained unsolved. The plague's cause was still attributed to bad air, divine wrath, or astrological influence, not to bacteria transmitted by fleas. The treatments that had failed during the plague were still applied to ordinary illnesses. The humoral theory still provided the framework for understanding disease. Nothing had really changed except the scale of the suffering. So as you lie in your hospital bed, perhaps during a plague year, perhaps in the uncertain decades that followed, you understand that the institution around you has seen worse. It has survived catastrophe. The brothers and sisters who care for you have inherited a tradition shaped by unimaginable loss and continued anyway. They know, in a way that modern caregivers often don't, that sometimes there is nothing to be done except stay present with the dying. That knowledge doesn't make you any safer, but it might make your caregivers a little more humble, a little less confident in theories that have failed before and might fail again. The plague taught the medieval world that death could come for anyone, regardless of station or virtue. The hospitals learned that their mission wasn't really about curing disease. It was about caring for the sick, even when caring meant only accompanying them toward an end that couldn't be prevented. That lesson, at least, was worth learning.
Not all medieval hospitals served the general population. Some were dedicated to specific conditions, and none was more dreaded than the disease that confined its sufferers to isolation hospitals, where they would spend the rest of their lives. Welcome to the Lazar House, the hospital for lepers, where the sick were separated from society not for their own benefit, but for everyone else's. Leprosy, or what medieval people called leprosy, which likely included several different skin conditions, was believed to be highly contagious and incurable. Those diagnosed with the disease were subjected to a ritual that essentially declared them dead to the world. They were separated from their families, stripped of their property rights, and confined to special hospitals where they would live among their fellow sufferers until actual death caught up with the social death they had already experienced. The ceremony of separation was chillingly thorough. The leper might be made to stand in an open grave while a priest recited funeral prayers, symbolizing their departure from the community of the living. They were given the distinctive clothing that marked their status, a long robe, gloves, a hat, and the clapper or bell they were required to sound to warn healthy people of their approach. They were forbidden to enter churches, markets, or other public spaces. They were forbidden to touch children or pregnant women. They were forbidden to speak to anyone until that person had moved upwind. The leper hospital provided a home for these outcasts, but it was a home defined by exclusion. The buildings were typically located outside city walls, far enough from healthy populations to prevent transmission, but close enough to receive the charitable donations that funded their operation. The residents lived in a community of the damned, caring for each other since no one else would touch them, praying together, and waiting for death. Life in the leper hospital followed rules designed to maintain order among people who had nothing left to lose. Residents might be organized along quasi-monastic lines, with regular prayers, assigned duties, and hierarchies of authority. They grew food, produced crafts, and maintained their buildings as much as their condition allowed. Some leper hospitals became remarkably self-sufficient, small communities within the larger community that had expelled them. The medical care in leper hospitals was minimal, since the disease was considered incurable. What treatment existed focused on managing symptoms and providing comfort. Baths and ointments might soothe damaged skin. Prayers and spiritual counsel might ease troubled minds, but there was no expectation of recovery, no treatment plan aimed at cure. The hospital was a holding facility for people waiting to die, not a place of healing. The fear that drove lepers into these institutions was not entirely irrational. Leprosy is genuinely contagious, though far less contagious than medieval people believed, and it does cause progressive damage to skin, nerves, and bones. But the medieval response was disproportionate to the actual risk, driven by religious symbolism that associated leprosy with sin, corruption, and divine punishment. Lepers were treated as spiritually as well as physically contaminated, their disease a sign of moral failure that justified their exclusion from normal society. Some lepers found meaning in their condition. The religious framework that condemned them also offered a path to redemption. If leprosy was a form of suffering imposed by God, then accepting that suffering with faith and patience could be a form of holy service. Some lepers came to see themselves as specially chosen for purification through affliction, their visible corruption a guarantee of invisible grace. Whether this theology brought genuine comfort or merely rationalized unbearable circumstances is impossible to know. The population of leper hospitals fluctuated over time. Leprosy seems to have declined in Europe during the later Middle Ages for reasons that are still debated. As the number of genuine lepers decreased, some lazar houses found themselves with empty beds and diminishing purpose. Some closed, others transformed, shifting their mission from leprosy to other forms of poverty, illness, or social exclusion. The buildings that had housed the outcast became almshouses for the elderly, shelters for the homeless, or hospitals for the generally sick. The legacy of the leper hospital was mixed. On the one hand, it represented a systematic approach to managing contagious disease, separating the sick from the healthy in ways that might actually have limited transmission. On the other hand, it was a system of social death that destroyed lives and families, justified by theories about contagion that were largely wrong, and by religious ideas about sin and punishment that were cruel. The leper's lot was a preview of how society would respond to other stigmatized conditions in centuries to come. So, if you're lucky enough not to have leprosy, spare a thought for those who weren't so fortunate. Somewhere beyond the city walls, in a building you probably never visit, there are people living out their days in isolation, caring for each other because no one else will, praying for souls that society has already written off. They're still human beings, they're still suffering, and they're still hoping, against all evidence, that God has not forgotten them. The leper hospital reminds us that medieval charity had its limits. There were some people even compassion couldn't reach, some suffering that society chose to hide rather than heal, some outcasts who remained outcast even in institutions supposedly dedicated to care. It's not a comfortable reminder, but it's an important one.
Let's step back and consider something that might seem obvious but is actually remarkable. Why did people work in medieval hospitals at all? The conditions were terrible, the patients were suffering, the treatments didn't work, the risks of infection were ever present. And yet, generation after generation, men and women chose to dedicate their lives to this grim and thankless work. What drove them? For the religious brothers and sisters who staffed most hospitals, the answer was theological. Caring for the sick was a form of service to Christ, who had identified himself with the suffering and commanded his followers to care for them. The famous passage from Matthew's Gospel, "I was sick and you visited me," provided the scriptural foundation for hospital work. To care for the sick was to care for Christ himself, disguised in the bodies of the suffering. This theology transformed the meaning of hospital work. Emptying a bedpan wasn't just a dirty job, but an act of worship. Washing a patient's wounds wasn't just nursing, but prayer made physical. The more disgusting the work, the more spiritually meritorious it became, since it required overcoming natural revulsion in service of something higher. The hospital became a site of sanctification, where caregivers could work out their salvation through service. For those with religious vocations, this framework provided meaning and motivation. But not everyone who worked in hospitals was pursuing sainthood. Some staff were there because they had no other options. Lay workers hired for wages might have chosen hospital work simply because it was available, because it provided food and shelter, because the alternatives were worse. For these workers, theology provided justification, but not necessarily motivation. Whatever their reasons for being there, hospital workers developed professional identities and skills. They learned to recognize different conditions and their usual courses. They learned which treatment seemed to help and which seemed useless, even if their theoretical explanations were wrong. They learned to provide comfort when cure was impossible. They learned the rhythms of institutional life, the politics of hierarchy,
the art of managing difficult patients and demanding superiors. The emotional demands of the work were enormous. Watching people suffer and die, day after day, required either profound faith or profound numbness. Some caregivers burned out, their compassion exhausted by the endless parade of misery. Others developed a detachment that protected them emotionally, but might have affected their care. The most effective hospital workers seem to have found a balance, remaining emotionally present with patients while not being overwhelmed by their suffering. The rewards of the work were largely intangible. Wages were low when they existed at all. Social status was limited, especially for those who did the hands-on caregiving rather than the administrative work. The gratitude of patients, when it came, was heartfelt but fleeting. Those who recovered left. Those who didn't were buried. The work continued regardless. And yet, people kept doing it. For 1,000 years and more, men and women showed up in hospital wards, changed bandages, spooned broth into mouths that could barely swallow, held hands that were losing their grip on life. They did this work knowing that their treatments were largely ineffective, knowing that most of their patients would not recover, knowing that they themselves might become patients at any time. There's something deeply human in this persistence. The impulse to care for the suffering isn't rational exactly. It doesn't depend on the expectation of success. It's more fundamental than that, a recognition that suffering calls for a response, that being present with someone in pain has value even when that presence can't eliminate the pain. Medieval hospital workers didn't have modern medicine's ability to cure. What they had was the willingness to stay, to witness, to accompany. They sat with the dying when everyone else had fled. They touched the bodies that others found repulsive. They offered prayer when they couldn't offer treatment because prayer was something, and something was better than nothing. So as you lie in your hospital bed, tended by people whose treatments you might not survive, remember that their presence itself is a gift. They didn't have to be here. They chose this work, or fell into it, or were called to it, and they keep choosing it every day they stay. They're not heroes, exactly. They're just people doing a job that needs doing, in circumstances that make the job almost impossible. That's not nothing. In fact, it might be everything.
In the midst of all this medical horror, let's acknowledge something important. Not everything medieval hospitals did was harmful. Some practices, whether by accident or insight, actually helped patients. And some benefits of hospital care had nothing to do with medicine at all, deriving instead from the simple fact of being cared for in a structured environment. Let's give credit where it's due. Rest was probably the single most helpful thing hospitals provided. In a world where most people worked physical labor from dawn to dusk, the hospital offered something rare and valuable: permission to stop. Patients could lie down, sleep, recover their strength without the constant demands of daily life. For conditions that would heal given time, this rest could be crucial. A body fighting infection needs energy for the immune system. A wound needs stillness to close. The hospital provided space for these natural healing processes to occur. Food, however simple, was another genuine benefit. Many hospital patients were malnourished before their admission, their bodies weakened by inadequate diet. The hospital's regular meals, even if they were just pottage and bread, provided calories, protein, and at least some vitamins. Patients who were too sick to feed themselves received help. Those who couldn't keep down solid food received broths and liquids. The basic provision of nourishment supported recovery in ways that medieval people understood intuitively, even if they couldn't explain scientifically. Shelter from the elements helped too. Exposure to cold, wet, and wind stressed already weakened bodies and made recovery more difficult. The hospital's walls and roof, however drafty, provided protection.
Fire and blankets provided warmth. Patients who might have died of exposure on the streets had a chance to survive indoors. Wound care, while imperfect, was better than nothing. Keeping wounds clean and covered reduced some infections, even if the theoretical understanding was wrong. Removing obviously dead tissue prevented some complications. Splinting broken bones allowed them to heal, even if the splints weren't perfect. Some medieval wound treatments, like washing with wine, might actually have had mild antiseptic effects. The overall approach was better than complete neglect. Herbal medicines, mixed in with the useless and harmful treatments, occasionally contained genuinely effective ingredients. Willow bark for pain and fever, poppy for sedation and pain relief, mint for digestive complaints. These remedies worked, at least somewhat, even if the explanations for why they worked were completely wrong. Patients who received them were sometimes genuinely helped. The psychological benefits of care shouldn't be underestimated. Being attended to, having someone check on you, knowing that people are concerned about your welfare, these all have measurable effects on health outcomes that modern medicine is still learning to appreciate. The placebo effect is real, and confident treatment by authority figures can trigger it. Medieval patients who believed they were being helped might actually have experienced some improvement simply because they believed. Social support mattered too. Patients in hospitals weren't alone with their illness. They had companions in suffering, people who understood what they were going through, people who might offer encouragement or distraction. The nursing staff provided human contact, conversation, the simple comfort of not being abandoned. These social elements of care contributed to well-being even when medical treatments failed. Spiritual care provided meaning in the face of suffering. For patients who believed, and most did, the religious framework of the hospital transformed their experience. Suffering became meaningful, a form of participation in Christ's passion, a path to salvation. Death became not an end, but a transition, a journey to be prepared for with specific rituals that promised protection and hope. This framework didn't reduce physical suffering, but it might have reduced the existential terror that accompanies serious illness. The routines of hospital life provided structure that could be comforting in its predictability. Patients knew when meals would come, when prayers would be said, what the daily rhythm would be. In the chaos of serious illness, when the body is out of control and the future is uncertain, this predictability offered a kind of anchor. None of this made medieval hospitals good by modern standards. The harm done by ineffective and dangerous treatments surely outweighed these modest benefits for many patients. But it's worth acknowledging that even in the worst medical system, there were elements that helped. And it's worth recognizing that some of those elements, rest, nutrition, shelter, social support, and psychological comfort, are still important today, even though we've added effective medicine to the mix. So as you lie in your hospital bed, receiving treatments that might kill you, you can also appreciate the things that might actually help. The bed itself, the food, such as it is, the sister who checks on you and holds your hand, the prayers that give meaning to your suffering. These small mercies might not save you, but they might make your journey, wherever it leads, a little more bearable. And in the medieval hospital, that's the best you can hope for.
As we near the end of our journey through the medieval hospital, let's step back and ask why any of this matters. These institutions existed centuries ago. Their medicine was wrong. Their patients are long dead. What does their story have to tell us about healthcare today, or about the human experience of illness more broadly? The first lesson is humility. The physicians who bled their patients and the surgeons who operated without anesthesia weren't stupid or evil. They were working with the best knowledge available to them, applying logic and theory to problems they genuinely wanted to solve. They were confident in their methods because those methods were supported by ancient authority, academic consensus, and internal coherence. And they were almost entirely wrong. This should give us pause. Modern medicine is incomparably more effective than medieval medicine, but it's not perfect, and future generations will look back on some of our practices with the same horror we feel looking at bloodletting. We are always, in every era, partially ignorant, and the confidence with which we apply our current knowledge may be no more justified than the confidence of medieval physicians. The second lesson is about the importance of care, even when cure is impossible. Medieval hospitals couldn't cure most diseases. They didn't understand the mechanisms of illness. Their treatments often made things worse, and yet they persisted in caring for the sick, providing presence and comfort and spiritual preparation when they couldn't provide effective treatment. This is a lesson that modern medicine sometimes forgets. In our emphasis on cure, on technological intervention, on measurable outcomes, we can lose sight of the value of simply being present with suffering people. The medieval hospital got the medicine wrong, but it got something important right: the recognition that care matters even when cure is impossible, that accompanying someone through illness and death is valuable work even when you can't change the outcome. The third lesson is about institutions and their limits. Medieval hospitals were genuine attempts to organize care for the sick and poor. They mobilized resources, trained staff, developed protocols, and maintained operations over centuries. They were remarkable achievements of social organization. And yet they were also limited by their context, by the medical knowledge of their time, by the economic and political systems in which they operated, by the religious frameworks that gave them meaning. No institution transcends its context entirely. Even the best-intentioned efforts to help are shaped by the assumptions and limitations of their era. The fourth lesson is about the social dimensions of health and illness. Who got care in medieval hospitals and what kind of care they received depended on factors that had nothing to do with their medical needs. Wealth, social status, religious identity, and the presence or absence of stigmatized conditions all influenced access to care and quality of treatment. These social determinants of health haven't disappeared. Modern healthcare systems still struggle with questions of access and equity, still provide different care to different populations, still maintain hierarchies that affect who gets treated and how. The medieval hospital's inequities look obvious in retrospect, but we may be blind to the inequities of our own system. The fifth lesson is about the human need for meaning in the face of suffering. Medieval patients and caregivers worked within a religious framework that gave meaning to illness, suffering, and death. This framework had costs, including the attribution of disease to sin and the acceptance of suffering as spiritually valuable. But it also provided benefits, including the ability to find purpose in experiences that might otherwise seem meaningless. Modern medicine operates in a different framework, one that treats illness as a biological phenomenon to be addressed through technical intervention. This framework has enormous advantages in terms of therapeutic effectiveness, but it can leave patients and caregivers without the resources for meaning-making that religious frameworks provided. We've gained cure, but may have lost some of the ability to cope when cure fails. The final lesson is about the persistence of human compassion. Through all the failures of medieval medicine, through all the harmful treatments and wrong theories, there were always people who showed up to care for the sick. They did this work not because it was effective, but because it was right, because suffering calls for a response, because leaving people to die alone is worse than trying to help, even when help is inadequate. This compassion is the thread that connects medieval hospitals to modern ones. The specific practices have changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental impulse to care for the suffering remains. It's what motivated the medieval sisters who emptied chamber pots, and it's what motivates the nurses who work exhausting shifts in modern intensive care units. The medicine evolves, the compassion endures. So, as you prepare to leave the medieval hospital, whether by recovery, by death, or simply by waking up from this long historical journey, carry these lessons with you.
Remember humility in the face of confident knowledge. Remember the value of care even when cure is impossible. Remember that institutions are always limited by their context. Remember that health is social as well as biological. Remember the human need for meaning in the face of suffering. And remember that compassion persists even when everything else changes. The medieval hospital was a place of horror by modern standards. It was also a place of genuine human effort to address suffering with the tools available. That effort didn't succeed in the ways its practitioners hoped, but it wasn't nothing. Nothing human is ever nothing.
And so here you are, at the end of your journey through the medieval hospital. Perhaps you've recovered, your fever broken, your wound healed, your strength returning. Perhaps you're dying, your body failing despite all the treatments that were supposed to help. Perhaps you're somewhere in between, neither recovering nor declining, stuck in an uncertain limbo where the future remains unclear. Whatever your fate, you've learned something about what it meant to be sick in the medieval world. You've learned that medicine was confident and wrong, that treatments were elaborate and often harmful, that the theories explaining illness were internally coherent and completely disconnected from biological reality. You've learned that hospitals were places of genuine care, even when they couldn't provide genuine cure. That the people who worked in them were motivated by faith, compassion, duty, or simple necessity. You've learned that death was treated not as a medical failure, but as a spiritual transition, and that the hospital's job was as much about preparing souls as healing bodies. You've learned about the economics of charity, the politics of healthcare, the social stratification that determined who got what kind of care. You've learned about the plague that overwhelmed the system, the lepers who were excluded from it, the workers who kept showing up despite everything. You've learned about small mercies and large failures, about human persistence in the face of suffering that couldn't be relieved. Most of all, you've learned that medical care has always been about more than medicine. It's about human beings confronting the vulnerability of their bodies, seeking help from other human beings who may or may not be able to provide it. It's about institutions that try to organize this help and inevitably fall short of the need. It's about the meaning we make of suffering and the compassion we offer to those who suffer. The medieval hospital got the medicine wrong, but it understood something important: that the sick need care, that the dying need accompaniment, that human beings facing their mortality need other human beings to face it with them. This understanding wasn't unique to the Middle Ages. It's universal, present in every culture that has developed institutions for caring for the sick, from the healing temples of ancient Greece to the high-tech hospitals of the modern world. As you drift towards sleep, real sleep now, not the fitful rest of a hospital ward, let the sounds of medieval medicine fade around you. The prayers growing distant, the moaning of patients receding, the bells marking the hours growing quiet. You're leaving this world behind, returning to your own, where medicine works better and suffering is still present, where hospitals are cleaner and patients still die, where we know so much more than medieval physicians and still face the limits of our knowledge. Take with you the lessons of history, the humility, the persistence, the recognition that care matters even when cure fails, the understanding that we are always partially ignorant, always doing our best with what we know, always hoping that our efforts help more than they harm. And take with you, if nothing else, a profound gratitude for antibiotics, anesthesia, and germ theory. Because the next time you complain about a hospital visit, remember what it could have been. Remember the bloodletting and the leeches, the chamber pots and the straw mattresses, the confident physicians who knew nothing, and the treatments that killed as often as they cured. Remember the medieval hospital, and count your blessings. As you drift off tonight,
tucked into your clean, quiet bed with central heating and antibiotics and emergency rooms within reach. Spare a gentle thought for everyone who came before. The patients who trusted physicians who couldn't help them. The caregivers who showed up anyway, day after day, doing what they could with what they had. The builders of institutions that tried and failed and tried again to organize human compassion into something that could address human suffering. They did their best. They got it wrong, and they kept trying. That's the story of medicine, really. That's the story of human beings facing mortality and refusing to accept it without a fight. We've gotten better at the fight. We haven't eliminated the mortality. Someday people will look back on our medicine the way we look back on theirs. They'll shake their heads at our ignorance, marvel at our confidence, and wonder how anyone survived our treatments. And they'll be right. And they'll be just as partially ignorant as we are, just as confident, just as likely to be judged by those who come after. That's the human condition. We do our best with what we know. We care for each other with the tools we have. We accompany each other toward an end we can't prevent, hoping to make the journey a little less lonely, a little more bearable. The medieval hospital knew this. In its crude, mistaken, often harmful way, it tried to do this. And in that trying, it was part of something larger than itself, something that connects all the healers and caregivers across history, something that will continue as long as human beings get sick and other human beings try to help. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and wake up grateful for how far we've come. And maybe, just maybe, a little more compassionate toward those still struggling to help in a world where perfect help is always just out of reach. Good night.